Hi everyone, you're watching the Haider Rifaat Show and I'm your host, Haider Rifaat. In today's exclusive episode, I've been joined by Dr. Christine Fair. She is a professor of security studies at Georgetown University, as well as an author. Thank you so much, Christine, for sparing time for this interview.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Now, Christine, take the viewers back in time. How did you start off in your career?
Well, it depends on how far back you want to go. But I mean, I'll answer you this. I mean, when I was growing up, this wasn't the career that I didn't even know such a career existed. And it certainly wasn't what I wanted to be when I grew up. Most of my childhood and well into college, I wanted to be a scientist. So I went to the University of Chicago, which was kind of an accident. I mean, I didn't really know. I thought it was, so first thing you have to understand is like, I'm first generation college, right? I'm from my family was mostly agricultural and basically blue collar, right? So I didn't really have anyone in my family that went to college. So there wasn't really anyone that could advise me. And in fact, there was a lot of opposition to my going to school. Like my stepfather would fight with my mother. He would say things like, we only have enough money to educate one of the kids, and it makes sense to educate the boy. So even my own mother, though she fought really hard for me to go to school, thought that I wanted to go to college because I was lazy, because I didn't want to do physical labor like her. So, I all along, going to school for me was never a foregone conclusion. So I didn't really get a lot of assistance in terms of like where I should apply or how I should apply. And the school that I went to didn't have very good guidance counselors. So it was kind of a random event in the sense that one of my mentors in high school, my English teacher, had a brain tumor. And I was really interested in the genetics of cancer. So I thought, well, if he went to the University of Chicago for treatment, so I thought, well, that must be a good place to go if he's going there for treatment. It was really, that is how I ended up at the University of Chicago. So I applied thinking it was a city school. That's like, what a Beva Kufi was. And I only applied to one other school because, applying to school is expensive. So sure. I applied to Purdue in the University of Chicago, and the University of Chicago in those days gave quite a bit of financial aid to students who were poor. But, it was tough being in the sciences as a woman at the University of Chicago. The sexual harassment was really unbearable. And I ended up leaving the sciences thinking that going to South Asian studies would be more bearable as a female. And, and of course, my first year that I was there, I was sexually harassed by this very famous professor known as Dipesh Chakrabarty. So, I mean, it was really just, I think you just had this realization that just sexual harassment happens. It's like racism or Islamophobia, there's not. And then I kind of understood what my mom had said to me all those years. It's like, just because you go to school doesn't mean you're going to be spared all of the stuff that she had gone through. So, and of course, along the way, my mom had died and I don't have a father. So just trying to not be homeless. I took a job at the Rand Corporation. And I was there when 9/11 happened. And that kind of really changed the arc of what I ended up doing for the rest of my life. It wasn't the career that I ever wanted. And I finished my PhD while working full time because of the situation on campus. I really didn't ever want to return to campus again. So it was not something that I had planned by any means. It's been fine. But now that I'm a full professor, I'm going back to the stuff that I really wanted to do when I began my PhD program. So I'm working a lot more in literature. I've been translating Punjabi stories. I'm currently translating some Urdu stories. So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah. But Christine, what really drew you to the South Asian region specifically? I mean, apart from all the other career opportunities that you had with regard to
Mm-hmm.
what specifically drew you to South Asia?
So again, it's really more random than perhaps you might think. So, I'm from Indiana. You know, um, Traveling abroad, that's just not something my family did. I mean, we took one vacation as a child, and that was we all loaded up in the car and we drove to Florida, right? I mean, so the idea of like travel was just not something that we did because we didn't have the resources. So when I was at the University of Chicago as an undergraduate, I had to work, right? I didn't have parents that had I didn't have the luxury of someone writing a check for me. So I began working in labs, right? So I worked in a lab I got a job immediately washing glassware in a lab. And in the course of working in those labs, I met a lot of South Asians, right? So, and I met South Asians from all over South Asia, Sri Lankans, Pakistanis, Indians, and within India, a lot of diversity. And when I was an undergraduate, for whatever reason, a lot of my friends were South Asian. And my non-South Asian friends tended to, for also whatever reason, be drawn to South Asia. So you just start, I mean, I found that I was just in a network, right? And I found it to be really interesting. I didn't know anything about South Asia. I mean, you have to understand, I was like a complete paindu. I couldn't have told you where India was on a map, right? I didn't, speaking honestly, I don't know at what point I even knew Pakistan was a country, right? I mean, that's the kind of school that I went to, right? So, instead of doing Western Civ as an undergraduate, we had to do a civilization course for one of our degree requirements. I did South Asian Civ. So that's when I began studying South Asia formally, was around 1990. I was really interested in languages. I worked with a lot of Bengali. So I started studying Bangla. Didn't really have a very good experience with a tutor. So I switched to Hindi. And then as I was leaving the sciences, I transitioned to South Asia. So I just had a lot of friends from South Asia. Again, like I never had Indian food until I went to college. And so I started hanging out with waiters, a lot of waiters. My mom was a waitress, among other things. I actually found, because of our class, our social class, I felt comfortable hanging out with people from my own background, even though we had a different, race, religion, and so forth background. What I shared with them was a class background, and I found at the University of Chicago, there weren't a lot of people from my class background. Almost everyone was from money. Their parents were educated. Like what they were going through wasn't anything like what I was going through.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it's like, I just tell students, follow opportunities, and opportunities come up in the weirdest of places. And that's really what happened with me. There wasn't a plan.
Right. Now, Christine,
I know that's a disappointing answer, but it's the truthful answer.
I mean, it's a story. Everybody has their own story,
Yeah.
Now, speaking of South Asia, how do you assess the impact of COVID-19 on South Asia's economic future? Because we know that COVID-19 overall has affected the global economy at large, specifically last year. But what about the South Asian region in particular?
So, it's hard to say because we're not out of it, right? I mean, what I think makes this wave in India, and I'm hoping that Pakistan doesn't get hit in the same way that India is being hit, but we're seeing it happen in Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and it's a matter of time, I think, before this wave hits Pakistan, when the first wave happened, right, wealthier people could insulate themselves from it, right? The people who were at risk were the people who were doing the deliveries, the sabzi mandis, the redi wallas, the cart wallas, right? Yeah. And so it hit a socioeconomic class that I think middle class and above could, quite frankly, ignore, which meant that the political elites could ignore them. This in India has been so profound. And if you kind of think about, I spent a lot of time in South Asia. I know how the corruption works, right? So for your average middle class person, they're kind of used to figuring out how do you pay rishvat to get basic things done, right? Really wealthy people, they know who to bribe at a very high level to avoid taxes, right? Really wealthy people have never had to negotiate for a hospital bed, right? So and of course the exceedingly wealthy people could just hop on an airplane, right? So this wave of COVID hit India in a place that made it very difficult to ignore, right? Because it wasn't just the poor people, it was middle class and above. And even though there's corruption, you just couldn't buy your way out of death with this wave of COVID, right? And so now the interesting thing is, it's I'm not a fan of Modi, right? I'm a strong secularist, and I do not like religious nationalism, be it in India, Pakistan, Israel, or the United States, right? When you have religious nationalism, you define citizenship in terms of religion, and that doesn't go hand in hand with democracy, right? And then once you do that, you then have to say, who is the right Muslim? Who is the right Hindu? Who is the right Jew? Who is the right Christian? Right? This is not a path that history has shown us to be a path that provides safety for all citizens. And so India is going down that path. It made a commitment to that path some time ago, right? And we're seeing the sort of the apotheosis of those commitments. But what's really surprised me is how much the political elites are seeking to exculpate Modi, right? It's very similar to what went on in the United States with Trump, right? So the religious nationalist core are making all sorts of excuses for Modi, but I don't think you can't excuse away the Kumbh Mela as an explanatory variable for this massive explosion. And of course, his election rallies, right? But what I've really found surprising is that Indians have not had their eyes opened about the culpability of this government. His bucks remain really bucks. They haven't really been moved. So I think some of the things that people were predicting, like a sea change in political preferences, I don't think that's going to happen. I suspect that Bangladesh is going to continue to do fairly well because the government capacity is so lousy. What Bangladesh has always done is just sort of outsource to the NGO sector, and the NGO sector is really quite practiced. So it's of all of India's neighbors, Sri Lanka also has a pretty good public healthcare sector, right? So I think it's also kind of exposing these differences among South Asian countries in terms of the basic investments that they have or have not made in public health.
Right. Now, Christine, how do you view the prospects of peace in Afghanistan following Biden's decision to withdraw forces?
So look, I have been very critical of Pakistan, and I have been equally critical of the United States, right? The United States, the way it chose to run this war, the seeds of American defeat were sown really early on because, I would say in the earliest days, the United States did not understand the importance of the Northern Alliance not taking Kabul, right? That for Pakistan, the Northern Alliance was a proxy for India and also Iran, in the same way that the Taliban are a proxy for the ISI. And I think there are other things that the United States did that I was an opponent of. I was not a supporter of the Indo-US civilian nuclear deal. I understood that that would dramatically make Musharraf and the strategic elites feel less secure. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that Pakistan began its reversal at about the time that this deal was going forward. And then, there's very specific things about militarily how the United States conducted the war that we can talk about. If you actually looked at all the countries that were operating at the height of the war, every country had these caveats, like the Germans wouldn't actually fight unless they were fired on. So it looked like there was a very large number of soldiers, but when you laid these different national caveats, you had a very patchworky, quilt of inefficacy. And then even within each country, different services had different rotations. And the US never got over its reliance upon translators. The US never quite figured out how to have relations with Iran, because you could not, I was an opponent of the surge because we were losing because of Pakistani support for the Taliban, but the surge made us more dependent upon Pakistan, right? So depending upon the year, you could just kind of go through and identify the sources of failure over time. And that's kind of where we are. If you are a student of Pakistan's strategic culture, you'll understand that Pakistan inherited this notion of strategic depth from the British. Zia al-Haq did not invent it. This was something that the British developed with their forward policy and their closed border policy. So the Pakistanis are never, and by Pakistanis, I don't mean the people. I mean, of course, the strategic elites and the army and the ISI in particular. They're not going to relent until Afghanistan is a client. And the Afghans are not simply going to surrender to Pakistan and agree to be a client. And then you have other countries that have their own interests as well, which will at times surface, which will either exacerbate one or both sides' perception. So I don't think peace is on the cards, because the United States was never able to really understand that you could not go to war with the country as your partner that was actually dedicated to undermining your efforts. And then I think the US also, likes to tell itself stories that aren't true. When the US promoted this notion of dehyphenization, which is the US will have a relationship with India and a relationship with Pakistan, and they will not be connected, that they will not affect one another. That's a great piece of political rhetoric, but it's not true, right? Because for every F-16 that the United States sells to Pakistan, that produces a response in India. The US-India nuclear deal was specifically bomb friendly, right? This is going to necessarily make Pakistan rethink some of its own doctrinal as well as operational commitment. So this is a really good example in my South Asia security class. This is an example of a security dilemma. And it's a nested security dilemmas, right? So India's security dilemma vice China causes India to want to pursue defense modernization. India, when it engages in doctrinal innovations as well as revolutions in military affairs, even though it might be directed toward China, Pakistan necessarily has to view that as offensive as opposed to defensive. And then Pakistan in turn makes decisions which affect the Afghans and how they view Pakistan, and then it goes back and reflects upon India and so forth. So structurally, all of this means that peace is really not likely until, and I know your audience is mostly Pakistani, until Pakistan becomes satisfied with its borders, right? And stops being territorially revisionist, and also stops seeking to retard India's rise in the international system. And for Afghanistan, I find myself frequently frustrated with Afghans. You cannot accuse Pakistan of cross-border terrorism while also denying the legitimacy of that border, right? It is unlike Kashmir, which has a different history, that there is a body of international law, and the Durand Line was a treaty commitment. And Afghans' argument that Pakistan is an illegal successor state is not true. It's not a valid argument. And the Durand Line is a valid agreement, right? So it's, for someone who studies this region, it can be sometimes really exhausting because some stuff is just really obvious empirically. But when you layer on culture and history, it's not so obvious to the participants.
So let's talk a bit about the Palestinian Lives Matter movement. We know that how the Israeli forces barged into Masjid al-Aqsa during the month of Ramadan and kind of declared war on Palestinians. And by stats, we know that 248 people have already died, including 66 children, which does not even compare to the death toll in Israel, which is above 10. So from a personal standpoint, what do you think is a long-term strategy to the decades-long Israel-Palestine conflict? And what are your overall views on the Palestinian Lives Matter movement?
First of all, they didn't declare war on Palestinians, right? So we can criticize Israel by remaining neutral, right? And retaining some fidelity to the facts. They have declared war on Hamas. And the reason why they have declared war on Hamas, this didn't come out of anywhere, as you had intimated. The Israelis control all entry into and out of Hamas, into Gaza, with the exception of the tunnels, which the Israelis seek to destroy. Mm-hmm. I've never been allowed to go into Gaza. I've been at I've seen the Israeli, I'm not sure really how to describe them. They have these very elaborate facilities where trucks in and out are very vigorously and thoroughly checked through a variety of physical as well as scientific means to check them for explosives and so forth. Gaza, in my view, it's really like a prison, right? All of your livelihood is dependent upon the Israelis. And of course, to be clear, the Israelis are in complete violation of UN Security Council Resolution 48, right, which called for a two-state solution, right? And the Palestinians themselves are in a political bind, right? Because the Palestinian Authority, right, Mahmoud Abbas, in the West Bank, elections are long overdue, and he refuses to call them. He's incompetent, he's inept. But quite frankly, if there was a Thomas Jefferson amongst the Palestinians, the Israelis would have assassinated him, right? And of course, Hamas is the political party that controls Gaza. And Hamas is it's like the Tamil Tigers, it's a terrorist organization that also provides social services, right? So this is a very successful model. Hezbollah does the same thing, right? So if you are a person in Gaza, you were actually getting pretty frustrated with Hamas because their situations hadn't improved whatsoever. And so if you're Hamas, what does improve your standing is a conflict with Israel. And when Israel was limiting the movement of Palestinians during Ramadan, the Hamas in Gaza began rocketing Israel. Now, what are these rockets? They frequently don't even have an explosive warhead. So when they don't detonate, right? It's like an elaborate catapult, which is why you have these very different asymmetric death, casualty figures, right? And of course, Israel has an incredibly sophisticated military, and it uses these rocket attacks as an excuse to go in and just murder at will. And Israel says that it has to do this because Hamas is using Palestinians as a human shield. But if you actually look at Gaza, it has one of the highest population densities in the world. It's impossible, given the size of Gaza, for Hamas to be located safely out of the civilian range. So I'm not a fan of Hamas. I'm not a fan of what Israel is doing. But if you are a Palestinian and your fundamental rights are being abrogated and no one seems to care, I don't know what options are left for you. So if you're asking what the solution is, obviously, if there was a solution, someone would have solved the problem. But I don't see that there is a solution, because Israel, like Pakistan, like India, like the United States, the populist, religiously motivated right wing is consolidating its control over the country. And President Trump certainly gave a fillip to Netanyahu, like, for example, moving the consulate to Jerusalem. So where many Israelis are going is a one-state solution, right? Which is where Israel owns everything. This will essentially mean an apartheid state, right? There's no two ways about it. It means that Israel is no longer going to be a democracy. But I don't see anyone willing to do anything meaningful to restrain Israel. In the case of the United States, we have a very strong ensemble of political lobbying organizations that very prudently go after both sides of the political aisle. And they have a very strong hold over the Christian fundamentalists in this country, who are the majority, because they believe that Israel has to exist for Jesus to come back. And when Jesus comes back, he dispatches all the Jews to hell. But if you're an Israeli, you don't care what theology Christian fundamentalists espouse, because you don't believe in a hell. And they help you politically, and they help you raise money for what you're trying to achieve temporally. So I don't see a solution. But I would also caution, I think Israel is coming under more scrutiny, but I don't think it's because Americans are generally having an appreciation of how precarious and immiserated the lives of Palestinians are. I think what Americans are experiencing is a very deep-seated return of anti-Semitism. And too often, anti-Semitism is cloaked in a Palestinian rights narrative. But the same people that are attacking Jews would not hesitate whatsoever to attack a Muslim. So I don't see a Palestinian Lives Matter movement, perhaps as you do. I see anti-Semitism, and really violent anti-Semitism, being undertaken in the name of protesting Israeli behavior. But rest assured, this is Islamophobic. This is a cloak of convenience, in the same way that the anti-Asian American hate is a cloak of convenience. The same, yeah.
Sorry to interject, but Christine, don't you think that criticizing a country based on just grounds should not be equated to anti-Semitism? Because we know if something,
but that's not what I did.
Yeah, I know. I'm not talking about you. I'm not talking about you. But if someone criticizes Pakistan based on legit grounds, that doesn't make them anti-Muslim.
Correct.
So why would it?
I agree.
Semitic.
Well, first of all, I agree with you, right? I criticize Israel, and when people call me anti-Semitic for doing so, I shut them down. I say I criticize Pakistan. I am certainly not Islamophobic, but what you have to understand is that some people do, right? Some people are Islamophobic because they generalize to all Muslims what a handful of terrorists do.
True.
Right? And also they think Sikhs are Muslims. So whether we like it or not, I mean, look, when I've been in Pakistan, I mean, I am a Republican. I am not a Republican. I'm a Democrat. I wasn't supportive of the Iraq War. And I don't like how we've waged the Afghan war. But I would be caught up in anti-Americanism. I would be caught up in the anti-cartoon protests, right? And I am not Danish. So people are people. And what I have seen as an American, particularly in I would say it really began in earnest during the 2016 Republican campaign period when they were seeking a nomination. The most vile hatred was unleashed, and people have clung to excuses. Another really good example of this is coronavirus, right? I will retain my argument that I will criticize China's behavior, and that is not an excuse to brutalize an Asian American, right? But people are using it as an excuse to brutalize Asian Americans. That's the reality of it. If you look at some of the political movements, like for example, on campus where I'm a professor, many of the anti-Israel activities become an anti-Semitic gauntlet for our students, right? It becomes too easy for people to use geopolitical arguments to become a justifier for bias. And you and I are on the same page, right? We're reflective, we're sentient people. But not everyone is that careful, right? Your average white person, like where I'm from, deeply afraid of African Americans because of the way in which African Americans are depicted on TV. They're criminals, they're, every horrible thing, African Americans are depicted as such. And African Americans are over policed, right? And so your television news programs are perpetuate these biases, right? And so I would argue it's the rare person who can hold a small number of people responsible for their actions without generalizing to the whole group. And Americans, I got to tell you, I spent a lot of time in Pakistan. Dude, we are more like than not. We are overly religious, right? We are overly supportive of our military and the belligerence of our militaries. We are undereducated relative to our peers, and we are easily swayed by political rhetoric coming from religious leaders. And this is not a recipe for thinking critically about others. So while I agree with you that we should be able to do this, unfortunately, I have seen anti-Semitism emerging from criticism of Israel, or even being justified by criticisms of Israel, in the same way that I have seen Islamophobia emerging from fears of Islamist terrorists, who are, what percentage of the Muslim world are terrorists? So small, we can't even give them a percentage, right?
Right. So, Christine, we know that the US government funds Israel billions of US dollars annually with regard to military aid. And just recently, Biden announced $735 million worth of arms sale to Israel in light of what was going on in Gaza. So do you think it was a wrong move on Biden's part to provide this funding to Israel in terms of arms sale instead of de-escalating the issue at hand? And also, do you think, how much has the US government been contributing to the human rights violations in Gaza over the course of decades now?
Okay, so this is where I do have to say, I don't know if your facts are right? Because I don't study this as a subject. But arms sales in general don't work that way. Well, let me just first back up, right? So I've already stated that I support the two-state solution, right? I've already stated that I believe that both Israelis and Palestinians have a right to safe, secure states that are economically viable, right? Unfortunately, I don't believe that that's actually going to happen. So the United States, and the numbers, I mean, I could go to the Congressional Research Service and see what they are. So I can't confirm or disconfirm the numbers that you've identified, but they're a very large number, right? President George Herbert Walker Bush is the only president in my lifetime that actually deducted from the annual award, for lack of a better word, to Israel, the estimated value of the settlements, because he did not support the settlements, which is, you know, a Republican president, right, did not support the settlements. And what happened was very swift political retribution. And no one has subsequently attempted to do that, because the Israeli lobby and its affiliated lobbies, which are largely populated by evangelicals, will go after any politician. It doesn't matter what state they're in. I mean, Charlie Wilson, I think he's one of the most clearest articulators of this. You know, he was a congressman from Texas, but he was the first to say it wasn't the constituents in Congress from Texas that elected him, right? He was a very staunch Israel advocate, and he garnered quite a bit of support from the lobbyists, from the lobby organizations that were tightly aligned with Israel. So, I mean, I think the United States has a very long history of being on the wrong side of history, right? Similarly, when Pakistan was committing what historians and analysts like me will clearly call genocide, Pakistan, you know, conducted genocide against the Bengalis using American weapons. Pakistan has committed enormous human rights abuses in Balochistan and in the Pashtun areas with our weapons. And of course, the history of this in Israel is also very long and very unfortunate. President Trump also withdrew support from UN organizations like UNESCO if it recognized the Palestinian Authority. So the United States has a very long and dark history of supporting Israeli excesses, just as it has, unfortunately, many other countries. Pakistan is another recipient of this. I'm bringing home the Pakistan example because it's the one that I'm the closest to, right? The ISI directly supported Taliban attacks on my own soldiers. And at the height of ISI-sponsored attacks on my soldiers, we were still giving Pakistan billions of dollars every year. And the reason why I'm going through this in this way is that money is allocated to a country for political reasons that are not obvious. Arms sales, incidentally, go into the pipeline. You don't get arms tomorrow. I mean, Pakistan can, your own officials can explain this to you. The president can say what he wants to say. He can say anything. It's Congress that actually writes the bills. Congress has a budgetary process. It has to go through both of the houses. It then has to be approved by the State Department. And then, I mean, there's a very elaborate process. So by the time a president actually promises access to a weapon system, it may take up to 2 years or more for that weapon system to actually reach the target country. And that was, for example, one of the reasons why Pakistan was continuing to get arms shipments during the 1971 war, even though the State Department was in agreement that Pakistan was engaging in massive human rights abuses. I'm not a fan of my government's policy of support to countries like Israel. I do not believe we should be supporting countries that are not democracies. I do not believe we should be supporting countries that are ethno-religious states. Right? That's my own personal politics. But as a scholar of politics, I understand why we do it. Why we do it is because Biden is trying very hard to not alienate all of the right-wing nuts in my country. And he thinks that by supporting Israel in, quote, its hour of need, will bolster that part of his electorate, right? It's for the same reason why Pakistan all the time yowls about Kashmir. When if Pakistan cared about Kashmir, it would stop supporting terrorists in Kashmir. It's the same reason, right? So in contrast, no politician is going to be penalized for not supporting Palestinian lives. Quite the contrary. If you come out and you actively support the Palestinians, and I know from my own experience, you're labeled a supporter of terrorism, you're labeled all sorts of bad things because of the issues that we've already discussed.
Right. Now, let's talk a bit about racial violence in America against Asian Americans, as we were earlier talking about as well, because Stop AAPI Hate, which is a nonprofit in the US, which records hate crimes against Asian Americans, reported that 3,800 anti-Asian hate crimes took place in the US over the course of a year during the pandemic. And also NBC reported this. So do you think that former President Donald Trump's rhetoric with regard to the pandemic and labeling of the coronavirus as the Wuhan or China virus and his overall position on China really has kind of amped up these anti-Asian hate crimes in the United States that we're seeing today, right now?
All right, so again, I do not believe that new racists were made because of Donald Trump. I believe Donald Trump empowered racists. I also believe in reminding people that this was not a natural disaster, right? This virus was the direct result of policy decisions by the CCP, right? I have scientific articles, which include scholars from China on SARS from about 17 years ago that identified the wet markets, the continued trafficking of endangered animals and keeping them in bio-insecure environments. It gives rise to the zoonotic events of SARS and to this particular virus as well, right? So China, instead of doing what many of its neighbors did, which is close down those wet markets, try to curtail the trafficking in endangered wildlife, because of the economic growth of China, China actually expanded those markets, right? So this was not a natural disaster. This was a disaster made by the CCP. By the way, I'm not even going to raise the possibility that this was a virus that escaped from a lab. I mean, I actually don't think that's an outrageous allegation, as many of my left-leaning associates. I mean, every country has been trying to figure out how to either prevent the next pandemic or how to weaponize it, right? Every country has. So the fact that he called it the Wuhan, or personally, I've called it the Wuhan because I believe in holding China accountable. It is the way he mocked Asians. That is the problem. It's not what he said, it's how he said it, right? It's the same way that he has dehumanized just about every group except non-white Christian males in this country, right? He's dehumanized women, right? He has called us pigs. He has declared us to be rapeable or non-rapeable. This is how he has treated every human being in this country who is not a white male. He is appealing to white supremacists. What I think is actually interesting, and they never break these data down, so I can't speak to the whole ensemble of the data set, but some of the incidents that have made it into the media, they're not white people attacking Asian Americans as much as they are African Americans attacking Asian Americans. And have you spent time in the US at all?
Yes, I have. I'm actually.
Okay, then you might. So then you'll probably, so in cities or in a rural area?
Sorry?
In a rural area or an urban area?
Urban area, not the rural
area. Oh, then you'll know what I'm talking about. So because of structural white supremacy, chain businesses, banks, grocery stores, they are very loath to enter African American neighborhoods, right? So we talk about food deserts, we talk about bank deserts. Asian American entrepreneurs are some of the few that will invest in those communities. But you'll see when you go into those businesses that they'll often be very thick glasses, glass separating the proprietor from the shopper. There's a lot of distrust And so I think it's interesting that some of the more notable attacks they haven't occurred in the rural areas. So the whole story about the dumb hillbilly like me, we're actually seeing this in some of the most cosmopolitan cities of America. And I think what's actually being expressed is this tension between different non-white communities, and because they are blaming each other, right? So African Americans are resentful of the ways in which Asian Americans have treated African Americans. And let's be really honest, racism is not just stuck to white people. I mean, Asian Americans in this country you talk to any American GI who has served in an Asian country, you talk to any of the children of African American GIs with Asian women and what they've experienced, right? Racism isn't just the purview of white people. Many of my South Asian friends, or a girlfriend of mine, she's African American. She was married to a South Indian boy. Her family essentially paid her husband to leave her. So I think what's coming to the fore in this is that what we're seeing is that there's a lot of within people of communities of color, and that friction is surfacing. And unfortunately, the participants in these kinds of sort of non-white racism, they tend to blame each other instead of the structural white supremacism. It's structural white supremacism that keeps large chains and banks out of Black communities, right? So Asian Americans are getting the brunt of this anger instead of structural white supremacy, right? And that makes it really difficult. And I would say, whenever I have tried to have a discussion of this nature with my colleagues, I get a lot of pushback, right? Because people want to, right now, it's very fashionable to think that only white people are racist. No one wants to accept culpability, that we're all racist. And I don't mean this in a political statement. I mean this as a biological statement. As creatures, as animals, all of this is happening in our amygdala. I mean, like all animals, we're generalizers, right? We're trying to figure out shortcuts for our safety. This is a societal aggregation of our biology, but we're not reptiles. We're not sharks. We have this really amazing frontal lobe. And the job of that frontal lobe is to push back on that nonsense that our amygdala is producing.
True, that's true. Okay, towards the end, another important issue is the African community in America, which is being targeted by the law enforcement. We have seen cases like George Floyd, as you know, Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, Ma'Khia Bryant, Daunte Wright, and more recently, Andrew Brown Jr.
There are hundreds. You can't name them all. Yeah. Thousands, tens of thousands.
So do you feel that systemic racism is a contributing factor towards these types of violence that is taking place against these Black nationals? And how can the lives of Black nationals be safeguarded in a public space?
So I'm not sure I like the word Black nationals, right? They're Black citizens. And this might be a difference in the way we're using the word nationals. Yeah, sure. So I don't think there's any question that this is structural racism. This goes to the core of what this country is, right? White Americans may not want to hear it, but we were a country founded on, by, and through slavery, right? Is the first sin of this country, right? Was slavery. The southern states, the first billionaires in this country were billionaires because of enslavement. And when we had the Civil War, again, just like Pakistan, right? We all learn a very stylized history of our country, right? We never learned the truth. We never learned how bad slavery was. We never learned the real reason of the Civil War. We never really even learned that President Lincoln himself was a white supremacist, right? And the reason why we had the Civil War was not to liberate the slaves. That's also a historical fiction. Lincoln waged the Civil War because he didn't want the expansion of slavery. He was a very late comer to the fact that Blacks and white lives are equivalent lives. This was not something that he came into the presidency with. The famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, in one of them he admits that he doesn't believe Blacks are equal to whites, right? And the Emancipation Declaration did not free all slaves. It freed only those slaves in the Southern South. And the reason why he did this was to start an insurgency. So slaves that were in the border states and that were in the North were not freed, right? So the war eventually became a war against slavery, but Lincoln came to that position really only as a last resort. And unfortunately, after Lincoln was assassinated, his vice president became the president, and his vice president was actually a slave owner. Did you know that? So the president that oversaw Reconstruction was himself a slave owner, and he was himself a white supremacist. And the Reconstruction did not satisfy the goals that Lincoln would have set out, right? To make sure that this country proceeds forward without this continued inequality. In fact, Lincoln, he didn't even want freed Blacks to stay in the country. He wanted to send them to Africa, right? People just don't understand what Lincoln was really up to. So when I think of the Civil War, the North won the war, but we actually lost the battle, right? Jim Crow South was the way in which the South was able to reimpose structural white supremacy and the economic benefits that accrued to whiteness. And we've never had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We've never talked about reparations, even though I'm from a lineage of families that was never slave owning. I still benefit from structural white supremacy. A similar person of my background, poor, rural, went to a really lousy school, but who was Black, probably would not have gotten into the University of Chicago, would probably not be a professor. But when you talk to white people about white privilege, I think there's a problem with that term, because most people who are white don't consider themselves privileged. And I know this from my own experience. The first time someone told me, well, you're benefiting from white privilege, I'm like, a single mom and no dad. Because poor white people compare themselves to rich white people. They don't compare themselves to Black people, right? So I've actually found that when I talk about these issues with other white people, I find that they're much more receptive to the term white advantage, right? Because for your average American, privilege is something that rich people have, right? Poor people don't think of themselves as having privilege. So talking about a white advantage is something that I have found white people, I'll say to my community members back at home who are white, when your son turns 16 and he gets pulled over by a cop for speeding or maybe having some pot in the car, you don't have to worry about him not coming home. But your Black counterpart, that Black parent of a kid who looks just like your kid in every way except his skin color, has to worry. That's white advantage. So anyone who says otherwise, that this isn't white supremacy, that this isn't racism, is fooling themselves. Until we have a Truth and Reconciliation process, until we have reparations, we will not be able to overcome this country's first sin, which was the enslavement of Africans. This country was built by slaves. The White House was built by slaves. Literally, it was built by slaves. Even when we committed genocide against the Native Americans, that was in an expansion westward that was enabled by slavery. So ethnic genocide of the Native Americans was our second sin. Our first sin was slavery. and it remains our sin.
Right. On that sad note, we have to conclude the interview, but thank you so much, Christine, for joining. It was a pleasure having you on the show. That is all for now. That is all for now. Thank you so much for joining me, guys. Stay tuned for more on my official YouTube channel and Facebook page. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Khuda Hafiz.